In the vastness and vibrancy of Native American history, one figure stands as a shining beacon of bravery and resilience. Geronimo. Born into the Chiricahua Apache tribe in the 19th century, Geronimo's name would become synonymous with the unwavering spirit of resistance against overwhelming odds as the United States government stole and encroached on native land. Geronimo's story is not just of a legendary warrior, but of a man who defied the tides of change that swept across the American Southwest during a tumultuous era. His tale is one of daring escapes, relentless battles, and a profound connection to the land he called home. But it is also a story of the price paid for that resistance, as his people faced the inexorable forces of change and displacement. As we delve into his life, his remarkable feats, and the enduring legacy he left behind, we uncover a narrative that speaks to the heart of the human spirit. We will peel back the layers of history to reveal the complexities of his character, leadership, and unyielding commitment to preserving his people's way of life. We embark on a journey to recount the remarkable exploits of Geronimo, a man resolute in his quest to liberate his people from the shackles of Western oppression. However, before we continue with this video, we kindly invite you to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification button so you do not miss any future posts from the People Journal. Geronimo's birthplace was nestled within the Bodonkoi Apache band near Turkey Creek, a tributary of the Gila River in the modern-day state of New Mexico. It is essential to acknowledge that Mexico claimed this region during this time, although the Apache fiercely contested Mexico's territorial assertions. Within the Bodonkoi Apache, Geronimo's grandfather, Mako, held the esteemed position of chief. Geronimo's family included 3 brothers and 4 sisters, and his birth name was Goyale, signifying the one who yawns, in the eloquent Mescalero Chiricahua dialect of the Apache language. While Goyale was his given name, he would later become widely recognized as Geronimo among non-Apache communities, particularly during the turbulent era of the Apache Wars and his subsequent public appearances. Geronimo's upbringing was steeped in the rich tapestry of Apache traditions. Following the loss of his father, his mother guided him to reside with the Chihendi, where he spent his formative years immersed in the teachings of his people. Geronimo took his vows of matrimony at 17 with a woman named Alope, a member of the Nedni Chiricahua band of Apache. Together, they brought 3 children into the world, marking the inception of a union that would see Geronimo take 9 wives throughout his lifetime. A pivotal event etched indelibly in the annals of history occurred on March 5, 1851, when a formidable company of 400 Mexican soldiers launched a daring assault on Geronimo's camp just beyond Llanos, known in the Apache tongue as Casquilla. These Mexican soldiers, who mostly hailed from Sonora, were under the command of Colonel Jose Maria Carrasco. The assault occurred while the campmen were away trading in the town. Carrasco contended that his pursuit of the Apaches to Llanos, Chihuahua, stemmed from a prior raid they had executed in Sonora, where they had seized livestock valuables and decisively defeated Mexican militia forces. Tragically, among the casualties of Carrasco's attack were Geronimo's wife, children, and mother. This profound loss fueled Geronimo's lifelong hatred toward all Mexicans, leading him and his followers to frequently engage in attacks on and killings of Mexican groups they encountered. Throughout Geronimo's adult life, his hatred, mistrust, and dislike of Mexicans were markedly more pronounced than his feelings toward America. As they are currently categorized, Apachean groups include the Western Apache, Chiricahua, Mescalero, Jicarilla, Lipan, and Plains Apache. formerly known as Chiricahua Apache. The initial Apache raids on Sonora and Chihuahua occurred in the late 17th century. To counter these early Apache raids on Spanish settlements, presidios were established at Llanos in Chihuahua in 1685 and at Fronteras in 1690 in northeastern Sonora. This area was then part of the Opata territory. In 1835, Mexico instituted a bounty on Apache scalps, and 2 years later, Mangus Coloradas assumed the role of principal chief and war leader, initiating a series of raids against the Mexicans. The Apache raids on Mexican villages were frequent and brutal, leaving no region immune. Between 1820 and 1835 alone, approximately 5,000 Mexicans died in Apache raids, and 100 settlements were razed to the ground. Throughout decades of conflict between the Apache people, Mexicans, and the United States, raiding became deeply ingrained in Apache culture. It served strategic and economic purposes, often blurring the lines between raids for economic sustenance and acts of warfare. These raids ranged from the theft of livestock and other plunder to the capture and, at times, the torture and killing of victims. In response, Mexicans and Americans launched retaliatory attacks against the Apache, often marked by extreme violence and rarely limited to identified individual adult enemies, mirroring the Apache raiding tactic. This cycle of raiding and retaliation fueled a revolution of virulent revenge warfare that oscillated between Apaches and Mexicans, and later, Apaches and Americans. From 1850 to 1886, Geronimo and other Apache leaders conducted numerous attacks. Geronimo's motivations are driven by a deep desire for vengeance following the murder of his family by Mexican soldiers. During this period, he garnered a reputation for brutality that surpassed that of his contemporaries, as his fighting prowess spanned over 3 decades and became a defining aspect of his character. Within his Chiricahua tribe, Geronimo elicited mixed feelings. While he was respected as a skilled and influential leader in raids and warfare, he did not appear particularly likable and lacked widespread popularity among other Apaches. That was primarily due to his refusal to yield to American government demands, which caused some Apaches to fear the potential American response. Nevertheless, Geronimo commanded awe among the Apache people, who believed he possessed supernatural abilities that he could use for both benevolent and malevolent purposes. Eyewitness accounts by other Apaches recounted Geronimo's extraordinary skills, including his capacity to perceive distant events as they unfolded and his ability to anticipate future occurrences. Geronimo went on to demonstrate the power to heal his fellow Apaches. As time passed, Geronimo's leader, Mangus Coloradas, would seek Geronimo's assistance in seeking revenge against the Mexicans. This pivotal moment led to the emergence of the name Geronimo. This moniker originated from a battle where he courageously engaged Mexican soldiers with a knife. Undeterred by a deadly barrage of bullets, the exact source of the name remains a subject of debate among historians. Some suggest it may have resulted from pleas by the soldiers for help from Saint Jerome, Geronimo. Debo repeats this theory and speculates that it might have been the closest approximation the Mexican soldiers could muster to the sounds of his actual name. Although this seems unlikely phonetically, encounters involving attacks and counterattacks between Geronimo's Apache group and Mexicans were frequent. In December 1860, a surprise assault was launched by 30 miners on an encampment of Badonkohe Apaches along the western bank of the Mimbres River. Historian Edwin R. Sweeney noted that the miners killed 4 Indians, wounded others, and captured 13 women and children. Subsequently, Apache reprisals, including raids on U.S. citizens and their property, ensued. In 1873, Hostilities erupted once more when Mexicans launched an attack on the Apache. After months of mountainous warfare, the Apache and Mexicans reached a peace agreement at Casas Grande. However, after the terms were settled, Mexican troops offered mezcal to the Apache. While intoxicated, they unexpectedly attacked, resulting in the death of 20 Apaches and the capture of some. That forced the Apache to retreat into the mountain. Despite being outnumbered, Geronimo continued to resist Mexican and United States troops. His daring actions and numerous escapes from captivity between 1858 and 1886 earned him widespread renown. One legendary escape story suggests that Geronimo and his followers sought refuge in a cave in the Robledo Mountains of southwest New Mexico. U.S. soldiers reportedly waited at the cave entrance for Geronimo to emerge, but he never did. Later, reports circulated that Geronimo had been spotted outside the cave. This cave has since been named Geronimo's Cave, although no historical or oral records corroborate this event. It is worth noting that similar stories exist regarding other caves, where Geronimo or other Apaches allegedly entered to evade troops, but were not observed exiting. The Apache-United States conflict stemmed directly from the long-standing Apache-Mexican conflict that had been ongoing in the same general region since the early days of Mexican and Spanish settlement in the 17th century. While residing on reservations shielded the Apaches from the direct violence of warfare, they faced a higher prevalence of disabilities and deaths due to diseases like malaria. On the positive side, the government provided rations, although corruption among Indian agents sometimes led to dangerously scarce rationing. The Apache people, who had lived as semi-nomads for generations, were dissatisfied with the restrictive reservation system. In resistance to reservation life, various Apache leaders had previously led their bands in breakouts from the reservations on 3 separate occasions in April or August 1878, September 1881, and May 1885. Geronimo led his group of followers in breakouts from the reservations, seeking to return to their former nomadic lifestyle associated with raiding and warfare. After each escape, Geronimo and his followers would traverse Arizona and New Mexico, making their way to Mexico, where they engaged in killing and plundering as they moved, eventually establishing new bases in the rugged and isolated Sierra Madre Occidental Mountains. In Mexico, they were beyond the reach of us armed forces, utilizing their intimate knowledge of the challenging Sierra terrain to evade pursuit and shield themselves from attacks. The Sierra Madre Mountains straddle the border between the Mexican states of Sonora and Chihuahua, offering the Apache easy access to raid and loot small villages, haciendas, wagon trains, worker camps, and travelers in both states. From Mexico, Apache bands also conducted surprise raids back into the United States, often to replenish their supplies of firearms and ammunition. The breakouts and the subsequent return to Apache raiding and warfare prompted both the Mexican army and local militias, as well as United States military forces, to actively pursue and make efforts to either eliminate or capture renegade Apache groups operating off-reservation, including Geronimo's band, wherever they could be located. Because the Mexican army and militia forces in Sonora and Chihuahua struggled to suppress the numerous Chiricahua bands taking refuge in the Sierra Madre Mountains in 1883, Mexico granted permission to the United States to deploy troops into Mexican territory, allowing them to continue their pursuit of Geronimo's band and other Apache leader-led bands. On May 17, 1885, a group of Apache individuals, including Nana Mangus, the son of Mangus Coloradas, Chihuahua, Naishi, Geronimo, and their respective followers, departed from the San Carlos Reservation in Arizona following a display of force directed at the reservation's commanding officer, Britton Davis. General George Crook of the Department of Arizona responded by dispatching 2 military columns into Mexico. The first column was under the command of Captain Emmett Crawford, and Captain Wirt Davis led the second. Each column consisted of a cavalry troop, typically comprising around 40 men, and approximately 100 Apache scouts, recruited from among the Apache community. These Apache scout units proved highly effective in locating the mountain hideouts of the Apache bands and either eliminating or capturing their members. Geronimo's band found it profoundly disconcerting to realize that their fellow tribespeople had aided in identifying their hideouts. The pursuit of the Apache continued throughout the summer and autumn, spanning the regions of Mexican Chihuahua and eventually returning to the United States border. During this period, the Apache conducted persistent raids on settlements, resulting in the killing of other innocent Native Americans and civilians, and the theft of horses. Over time, the relentless pursuit by Mexican and American forces wore down the resolve of Geronimo and similar Apache leaders. It led to gradual and irreplaceable attrition among the members of their bands, ultimately eroding their will to resist and culminating in their eventual surrender. General Crook faced mounting pressure from the government in Washington, prompting him to initiate a second expedition into Mexico. On January 9th, 1886, Captain Crawford located Geronimo and his band. The Apache scouts, under Crawford's command, launched an attack the following morning, seizing the Apache's herd of horses and their camp equipment. This unexpected setback left the Apaches disheartened, and they were willing to negotiate for surrender. However, before the negotiations could be finalized, Mexican troops arrived and mistakenly identified the Apache scouts as hostile Apaches. The Mexican government had accused these scouts of taking advantage of their position to steal, rob, and murder within Mexican territory. Consequently, the Mexican forces initiated an attack that resulted in the tragic death of Captain Crawford. Lieutenant Mouse, the highest-ranking officer remaining, held a meeting with Geronimo, during which Geronimo agreed to meet with General Crook. For their rendezvous location, Geronimo selected the Cañón de los Embudos, also known as the Canyon of the Funnels, situated within the Sierra Madre Mountains. This location was approximately 86 miles, 138 kilometers, from Fort Bowie and roughly 20 miles, 32 kilometers, south of the international border, near the border separating Sonora and Chihuahua. Geronimo, who had set up camp on the Mexican side of the border, initially agreed to General Crook's terms for surrender. However, that night, a soldier providing them with whiskey warned them that his band would be in mortal danger as soon as they crossed the border. In response, Geronimo, along with Nakaite and 39 of his followers, slipped away during the cover of night. That sparked a series of heated telegrams between Crook and General Philip Sheridan, with Crook defending his men's actions. Eventually, on April 1st, 1886, Crook sent a telegram to Sheridan requesting to be relieved of his command, a request that Sheridan granted. General Nelson A. Miles took over from Crook as commander. In 1886, Miles appointed Captain Henry Lawton to lead B Troop, 4th Cavalry, stationed at Fort Huachuca, and 1st Lieutenant Charles B. Gatewood to head the expedition tasked with bringing Geronimo and his followers back to the reservation system for the final time. Lawton received orders to oversee operations south of the U.S.-Mexico boundary, where it was believed that Geronimo and a small group of his followers would seek refuge from U.S. authorities. Lawton's mission was to pursue, subdue, and return Geronimo, whether dead or alive, to the United States. Lawton's official report, dated September 9, 1886, summarized the actions of his unit and acknowledged several of his troops for their contribution. Geronimo credited Gatewood for his decision to surrender, as Gatewood was well acquainted with Geronimo, spoke some Apache, and respected their traditions and values. Lawton's relentless pursuit also played a crucial role in wearing down the Apaches, who had little time to rest or stay in one place. Exhausted and worn out, the small band of Apaches finally returned to the United States with Lawton and formally surrendered to General Miles on September 4, 1886, at Skeleton Canyon, Arizona. When Geronimo surrendered, he had a Winchester Model 1876 lever-action rifle with a silver-washed barrel and receiver, now displayed at the United States Military Academy in West Point, New York. He also had a Colt single-action Army revolver with a nickel finish and ivory stocks, and a Sheffield Bowie knife featuring a dagger-type blade and a stag handle. This knife was crafted by George Wostenholm and housed in an ornate silver-studded holster and cartridge belt. The revolver, rig, and knife are on display at the Fort Sill Museum. The question of whether Geronimo surrendered unconditionally remains a topic of debate. Geronimo consistently maintained in his memoirs that his people who surrendered had been deceived, and he argued that his surrender as a war prisoner, witnessed by uncontested observers, notably General Stanley, was conditional. In contrast, General Oliver O. Howard, chief of the U.S. Army Division of the Pacific, contended that Geronimo's surrender was accepted as a dangerous outlaw without condition. Geronimo and his fellow Apaches, including the Apache scouts who had assisted the Army in tracking him down, were transported as prisoners to Fort San Houston in San Antonio, Texas. They were held at this location for approximately 6 weeks before being relocated to Fort Pickens in Pensacola, Florida. Meanwhile, Geronimo's family was sent to Fort Marion, Castillo de San Marcos, in St. Augustine, Florida. This swift action by the Army prevented Arizona's civil authorities from intervening to arrest and prosecute Geronimo for the deaths of numerous Americans who had been killed during the decades of raiding. Local businessmen came up with the idea of showcasing Geronimo as a tourist attraction, allowing hundreds of visitors daily to glimpse the bloodthirsty Indian in his cell. During their time as prisoners of war in Florida, the government transferred numerous children from their Arizona reservation to the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania. Sadly, over a third of these students rapidly succumbed to tuberculosis, their deaths resembling the devastation of a plague, as detailed in the post's accounts. The Chiricahuas remained at Fort Pickens until 1888, when they were moved again to Mount Vernon Barracks in Alabama. Here, they were reunited with their families. However, after a quarter of the population perished due to tuberculosis, the Chiricahuas, including Geronimo, were relocated to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, in 1894. They established villages scattered around the post based on kinship groups. Like other Apaches, Geronimo was allocated a plot of land where he engaged in farming activities. During the train journey to Fort Sill, many tourists sought mementos of Geronimo, and he would sell them buttons cut from his shirt or hats taken from his head for 25 cents each. As the train made stops along the way, Geronimo would purchase more buttons to sew on and more hats to sell. In 98, Geronimo was part of a Chiricahua delegation from Fort Sill that traveled to the Trans-Mississippi International Exposition held in Omaha, Nebraska. Previous newspaper accounts of the Apache Wars had already left a strong impression on the public regarding Geronimo's name and exploits, and in Omaha, he became a major attraction. The Omaha Exposition elevated Geronimo to celebrity status, and from then on, he was sought after as an attraction at fairs of various sizes. The two most prominent were the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York in 1901, and the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904. Under Army supervision, Geronimo donned traditional attire, posed for photographs, and sold his crafted items. After the exposition, Pawnee Bill's Wild West shows arranged an agreement with the government to enlist Geronimo as part of their show, once again with Army supervision. In these exhibitions, the Native Americans were depicted as deceptive, thieving, treacherous, and murderous, responsible for numerous fatalities, including those of men, women, and children. Spectators were eager to observe how the once regarded savage had been brought under control, and they paid Geronimo to obtain a button from the coat of the infamous Apache leader. Although it is essential to clarify that Geronimo was not a chief, these shows generated significant income for Geronimo and allowed him to travel, albeit always under the watchful eye of government guards. In the 1905 inaugural parade of President Theodore Roosevelt, Geronimo rode on horseback down Pennsylvania Avenue alongside 5 Indian chiefs adorned in full headgear and painted faces. As one newspaper pointed out, the aim was to demonstrate to Americans that the hatchet had been buried forever. The group caused quite a sensation and garnered cheers from the crowds lining the parade route. Later that same week, Geronimo met with President Roosevelt and requested on behalf of the Chiricahuas at Fort Sill to be released from their prisoner of war status and allowed to return to their homeland in Arizona. However, President Roosevelt declined, citing the lingering animosity in Arizona stemming from the deaths of civilians, women, and children during Geronimo's raids throughout the extended Apache War. Through an interpreter, Roosevelt conveyed to Geronimo that he had a bad heart and reminded him of the harm he had inflicted on Roosevelt's people. Roosevelt said he would observe how you and your people behave on the reservation. In February 1909, Geronimo suffered a fall from his horse while riding home, where he remained exposed to the cold throughout the night until a friend discovered him in a highly ill state. Tragically, he succumbed to pneumonia on February 17, 1909, while still a prisoner of the United States at Fort Sill. On his deathbed, he confided to his nephew that he regretted his decision to surrender. His final words, as reported, were spoken to his nephew. "I should have never surrendered. I should have fought until I was the last man standing." His final resting place is at Fort Sill in the Beef Creek Apache Cemetery. And that is the end of today's video. Thank you for watching to the end. Remember to like the video and subscribe to our channel so you get notified each time we post another exciting narrative like this one.